Türkiye'nin konumunun ona verdiği imkanları kullanmak hevesi dolayısıyla Erdoğan yönetiminde çok yüksek. Dolayısıyla otomatik olarak o arabulucu rolüne aday bir ülke.
Something's changing, quietly but powerfully. For years, Africa was treated as a story written by others. But not anymore. A new alliance is forming, not forged in charity, but in strategy. Not in the shadows of old empires, but under new lights. Ankara and Africa, side by side. It's subtle, deliberate, and it's shaking the very balance the West once called permanent. Because what's unfolding right now might just redefine who holds the pen in tomorrow's world. But what's really going on? Let's find out. It began quietly. No explosions, no breaking banners, just the steady voice of a man who understood timing better than most. On October 17, 2025, inside Istanbul's glittering Congress Hall, President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan took the podium and delivered a line that sounded almost too gentle for what it meant. We have advanced our relations hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, and most importantly, heart to heart, to a level that could not even be imagined. To the untrained ear, it was routine diplomacy. But to anyone who studies power, it was a strategic declaration that Turkey and Africa had crossed a line, no longer trading partners, but partners in design. The West barely noticed. Perhaps it chose not to. For decades, Africa had been treated like a project to be managed, a continent that could be studied but never trusted. Yet while Washington debated sanctions and Paris clung to the last threads of its colonial relevance, Turkey was building things that could not be argued with. Airports, railways, factories, and trust. That's what made this moment different. This was not a country offering charity. This was a country offering equality. Erdoğan didn't raise his voice because he didn't have to. The results were already speaking. Trade between Turkey and Africa has grown from $5.4 billion in 2003 to nearly $40 billion today. Turkish contractors have completed more than 2,000 projects worth $97 billion, and investments exceeding $15 billion have created 100,000 African jobs. None of this was achieved through loans or lectures. It was built through partnership, through a philosophy that Africa's success is not a favor, but a mutual gain. Behind those numbers lies a deeper truth. Turkey has become the first nation in decades to earn influence in Africa without extraction. But nothing this coordinated happens overnight. Every alliance that looks sudden begins as a whisper no one hears. 2 decades ago, Turkey saw what others ignored, that Africa was not a charity case but the next center of gravity. When Ankara declared 2005 the Year of Africa, most Western observers dismissed it as symbolism. They were wrong. Embassies multiplied, business councils formed, and bilateral visits turned into habits. Turkey wasn't chasing headlines, it was cultivating permanence. That patience became its greatest weapon. Where Western powers imposed conditional aid, Turkey offered continuity. Where they sought submission, Turkey offered respect. Step by step, project by project, Ankara replaced suspicion with familiarity. And now, as Erdoğan stood in that hall speaking of heart-to-heart relations, what sounded poetic was in fact strategic. The culmination of 2 decades of groundwork built quietly under the radar of global arrogance. The truth is, Turkey didn't just enter Africa, it listened to it. It treated Africa not as a resource pit, but as a partner capable of shaping its own destiny. And that, more than the billions in trade, is what unsettles the old order. Because the one thing colonial powers could never imagine was an Africa that no longer needed their validation. Still, every fire has a spark, every movement an origin. Before the deals and the declarations, there was one decision that changed how Ankara and Africa saw each other. To understand this new alliance, we must return to that first act of recognition, the moment Turkey declared the Year of Africa and rewrote its place in history. The year was 2005, and Turkey was still finding its footing in a post-Cold War world, torn between its European ambitions and Middle Eastern realities. Then came a declaration that barely made global headlines. Ankara announced the Year of Africa. It sounded symbolic, almost decorative, but Erdoğan wasn't aiming for symbolism. He was laying the foundation of something bigger, a 20-year strategy that would quietly shift the world's center of gravity. At the time, Western powers were distracted. The United States was still entrenched in the Iraq War, Europe was lost in bureaucracy, and France was too busy clinging to its former colonies to notice that influence cannot survive without relevance. Africa, meanwhile, was changing. Populations were exploding. Infrastructure gaps were screaming for attention, and leaders were tired of being treated like tenants on their own soil. Erdoğan read the room better than anyone else. He understood one basic truth of geopolitics. Where others see exhaustion, opportunity hides. The Year of Africa wasn't just about diplomacy, it was about visibility. Turkey began opening embassies in capitals that most Western politicians couldn't even pronounce. In 2003, it had only 12 embassies across the continent. Today, that number stands at 44, soon to become 50. Each one wasn't just a diplomatic post, it was a statement. It said, "We're here to stay." And unlike Western missions fortified behind layers of suspicion, Turkish diplomats walked markets, ate local food, and spoke the language of respect. But embassies alone don't change perception. Actions do. So Turkey built relationships through construction, education, and healthcare rather than politics. Turkish contractors took on massive infrastructure projects across Africa, airports in Senegal, stadiums in Ghana, and hospitals in Somalia. Erdoğan's thinking was straightforward yet radical. If Africa was going to trust you, you had to build something it could touch. Every concrete wall, every flight route, every textile plant became a brick in the architecture of credibility. And credibility is currency. Once Ankara proved it could deliver, the rest followed. Trade, investment, tourism, and defense cooperation. Turkish Airlines connects 64 African destinations, turning Istanbul into a new gateway between Africa, Europe, and Asia. Aid was replaced by access, and speeches by systems that worked. Unlike the IMF's endless cycle of support and supervision, Turkey's approach was clean and tangible. Build first, talk later. Still, beneath all this growth was something far more strategic. Turkey wasn't just building for profit, it was building for positioning. It knew Africa's demographic rise would one day turn into political leverage, an emerging generation with a memory of who treated them as equals and who treated them as experiments. And that memory, once established, becomes the most powerful political weapon of all. By the time Western analysts realized what was happening, the narrative had already flipped. What they called influence, Africa called cooperation. What they dismissed as symbolism, history would later call the turning point. Because once Turkey's presence became normal, the question was no longer if Africa would trust it, but how far that trust could go. And that's where the story turns from symbolic to strategic. If 2005 was the match, then the years that followed were the fuel, an era where Turkey transformed soft gestures into hard power and friendship into a functioning network of economic and political alliances. So the question now is not whether Turkey's entry changed Africa, it's how that early patience evolved into a strategy powerful enough to challenge centuries of Western dominance. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Every successful partnership hides a method, and Turkey's engagement with Africa is no different. What appears on the surface as warmth and goodwill is, beneath it, a meticulously crafted strategy of influence through presence. Ankara didn't come to Africa to compete with the West's arrogance. It came to replace it with something more subtle, more enduring, dependable proximity. When Erdoğan speaks about equal partnership, it isn't just moral rhetoric, it's calculated diplomacy. The Turkish model works on three layers. The first is visibility, to be seen where others have retreated. Turkish Airlines, for instance, now flies to 64 destinations in 42 African countries, connecting cities that European carriers long abandoned. Each flight route is more than transport. It's a statement of consistency. Where others closed routes, Turkey built bridges. The second layer is credibility, to deliver what was promised every single time. Turkish contractors are not just constructing stadiums or roads, they're embedding Ankara's reliability into Africa's infrastructure. 2,000 completed projects worth $97 billion aren't just statistics, they're proof of an unbroken rhythm. Turkey says, then does. The result? A perception that Turkish commitment is not political theater but an operational fact. And the third layer, perhaps the most powerful, is familiarity. Turkey didn't build its influence through control, but through belonging. Unlike Western diplomats who approach Africa with detachment, Turkish officials arrive as peers. They speak of shared struggles, shared faith, and a shared resentment toward colonial arrogance. In many African capitals, Ankara doesn't feel like a visitor. It feels like a brother who came home late, but still came home. That emotional layer is strategic. Erdoğan understands that no amount of capital can buy legitimacy, only cultural alignment can. So Turkey invests not just in projects but in people. Scholarships for African students in Istanbul, training programs for African civil servants, and even cultural exchange networks that quietly shape how the next generation of leaders will view global partnerships. Over 15,000 African students have studied in Turkey, many returning as diplomats, engineers, or entrepreneurs who see Ankara not as a foreign power, but as a mentor. This is where Turkey's soft power becomes geopolitical muscle. It doesn't need to dominate. It simply needs to remain indispensable. Every runway paved, every embassy opened, every textile mill established becomes a node in a larger web, a network of gratitude and practical reliance. When the West preaches reform, Turkey quietly builds factories that feed families. When Western lenders enforce austerity, Turkish investors offer machinery and market access. One punishes, the other participates. And yet, the genius of this strategy lies in its balance. Ankara never pretends to be Africa's savior. It insists on being its partner. The tone is deliberate. Not "we'll help you," but "we'll do this together." This single distinction dismantles the psychological hierarchy that once defined Africa's global relations. But Turkey's patience is not naivety. Erdoğan knows every port built, every trade deal signed, increases his country's leverage in ways the West cannot undo. Africa gains independence from former colonial powers. Turkey gains reach across 54 nations, access to raw materials, new markets, and geopolitical goodwill stretching from the Sahel to the Cape. It's not exploitation, it's equilibrium. And the West feels it. Each Turkish-built airport in West Africa means one less airstrip under French monopoly. Each Turkish investment in East Africa's textile market chips away at Europe's manufacturing dominance. This isn't aggression, it's quiet correction. The result is a relationship built not on fear or favor, but on function. Turkey doesn't need to control Africa's narrative because it's already part of it. The alliance stands on practicality, an understanding that both sides gain what they need without surrendering who they are. But this story doesn't end with strategy. The next chapter is what happens when those strategies begin to reshape not just perception, but reality. When Turkish cranes and African hands start building something far greater than trade, something structural, continental, and irreversible. Because the strategy worked. Now the question becomes, what did it build? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. By the time the world realized what Turkey was doing, it was too late to call it diplomacy. It had already become architecture. The alliance that began with a handshake was now being written in steel, stone, and policy. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, Turkish cranes filled the skyline, while Ankara's flag quietly appeared on construction sites, power plants, and industrial parks that would one day anchor Africa's economic sovereignty. Walk through Dakar's Blaise Diagne International Airport, and you see Turkey's blueprint in action, a $600 million project completed by Turkish contractors, operated by a Turkish firm, serving as West Africa's aviation hub. In Mogadishu, a city once written off by the West, Turkey built hospitals, schools, and the largest foreign-run military academy in Africa, not to command soldiers, but to train them under Somali leadership. In Khartoum, Addis Ababa, and Accra, Turkish factories hum through the night, producing textiles, cement, and machinery that feed local industries instead of foreign imports. Each of these is more than infrastructure, it's a declaration. Turkey doesn't build and leave, it builds and stays. That staying power is what separates it from the extractive patterns that defined Western involvement for decades. Every completed project reinforces a simple message. Partnership can last longer than politics. But what's more striking than the physical structures is the network behind them, the political infrastructure that Ankara has quietly engineered. 49 business councils now link Turkish firms with African governments, ensuring direct channels of cooperation without Western intermediaries. 38 African nations maintain embassies in Ankara, creating a near-constant flow of dialogue and investment. What began as the Year of Africa has evolved into a continent-spanning framework of trust and access, the kind that makes traditional influence obsolete. And while the West continues to offer Africa lectures on reform, Turkey delivers logistics. The difference shows in outcomes. Trade between Turkey and Africa isn't based on resource extraction, it's built around production. African farmers export raw goods to Turkish industries, and Turkey returns finished technology, machinery, and expertise, a loop that multiplies value instead of draining it. It's a model that respects sovereignty, yet strengthens dependency in a way that's mutual, not manipulative. But Erdoğan's vision runs deeper than commerce. His understanding of Africa is not transactional, it's civilizational. He speaks often of shared pain, a reference to both the Ottoman Empire's lost influence and Africa's colonial trauma. That emotional symmetry matters. It allows Turkey to operate where Western nations cannot, inside the narrative of history itself. It's not just building airports, it's rebuilding dignity. This philosophy explains why Turkey invests in education and media almost as much as in trade. Dozens of African universities now partner with Turkish institutions, and Turkish television series dominate screens from Lagos to Nairobi, cultural exports that shape perception as effectively as policy. Even in religion, Turkey's Directorate of Religious Affairs has become an influential actor, restoring mosques and sponsoring local scholars, reinforcing a shared identity that transcends geography. And yet, Turkey's rise in Africa is not just Africa's gain, it's Africa's statement. Because every partnership signed with Ankara weakens the myth that Africa must choose between East and West. Now it has its own center. Turkey doesn't pretend to replace Europe. It simply shows that Europe is replaceable. This new architecture, economic, political, and cultural, is why Erdoğan's quiet confidence feels justified. He isn't just creating allies, he's creating ecosystems. Systems that interlock, endure, and defend themselves. It's not an empire, it's endurance, disguised as empathy. But here's the part the world still underestimates. This alliance has outgrown bilateralism. It's no longer about Turkey and Africa. It's about what this model inspires elsewhere. Because once Africa learns it can build global partnerships on equality, who says it has to stop with Ankara? The foundation has been laid. The structures are rising. The strategy is working. Now the only question left, the one keeping Western diplomats awake, is this. What happens when this alliance starts to shape the world beyond Africa's borders? What began as a diplomatic experiment has turned into a geopolitical shift the world can no longer ignore. The Turkey-Africa partnership is no longer a chapter in foreign policy. It's becoming a blueprint for how the global South will define power in the 21st century. And the irony is impossible to miss. While the West debates how to re-engage with Africa, Turkey has already built the engagement into reality. The signs are everywhere. The upcoming 4th Turkey-Africa Partnership Summit in Ankara isn't just another meeting of handshakes and promises. It's a declaration that Africa now has a partner capable of matching its ambition without undermining its sovereignty. For the first time, African leaders are entering such summits not as recipients, but as co-authors of the agenda. The symbolism is profound. A continent that was once managed by others is now negotiating on its own terms, and Turkey is standing beside it, not above it. This evolution also marks a larger truth about global politics, that legitimacy now matters more than legacy. The West's influence in Africa has always rested on history, on the illusion that experience equals entitlement. But Turkey's rise disproves that notion. Influence today isn't inherited, it's earned through relevance. And relevance is measured by who shows up, who delivers, and who listens. Ankara does all three. The future that's forming is multipolar, but not chaotic. It's calculated. Turkey doesn't want to replace Western dominance with its own. It wants to dilute dominance altogether. The logic is simple. If Africa can diversify its partnerships, Turkey, China, Russia, and India, it can finally break free from the binary trap of dependency. And in that landscape, Turkey becomes the trusted middle ground, the nation that speaks the West's language but understands Africa's wounds. This is what the West fears most. Not Turkey's power, but its credibility. Because once Ankara proves that respect and profit can coexist, the Western model of control collapses. Every new project, every trade route, every scholarship is another crack in the old structure of dependency. The colonial shadow is fading, not through revolt, but through replacement. But here's the deeper layer. Turkey's partnership with Africa is also reshaping how Africa sees itself. It's creating confidence where once there was caution. Nations like Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, and Senegal now speak of industrial independence, energy sovereignty, and South-South cooperation with a tone that feels irreversible. And that shift, that psychological unshackling, may be the most transformative part of this story. Because the real victory isn't that Africa has new allies, it's that Africa finally believes it can choose them. Still, the biggest test lies ahead. As Africa rises and Turkey expands, both will face pressure from Western powers eager to reassert control, and from new rivals who see Africa as the next frontier of competition. The question is whether this partnership can maintain its purity of intent in a world that thrives on manipulation. Can Turkey continue walking the fine line between investor and ally? Can Africa protect this newfound leverage without letting history repeat itself? These are not small questions. They define the next phase of global order. Because what Erdoğan started 20 years ago as the Year of Africa has now evolved into something much larger, a movement that challenges how the world measures influence. The West had centuries to prove its model. It failed. Now Turkey and Africa are proving theirs, quietly, confidently, and with results the world can no longer dismiss. And perhaps, decades from now, historians will look back and realize that the true shift of global power didn't happen in Washington, Paris, or Beijing. It happened in a conference hall in Istanbul, on the day the West looked away. Do you think the Turkey-Africa alliance is a genuine partnership, or the birth of a new kind of global power bloc? Let us know in the comments section. Can Africa protect this independence it's building? When the world's old powers start pushing back? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.
Deposit Photos Music.